The National Endowment for Liberty presents At Issue, the in-depth forum on freedom in America today. Hello, I'm Michael Hayes. The host of At Issue is the physician, author, and former member of Congress, Ron Paul. Ron?
Thank you, Mike. Few issues stir more passions than the questions of laws to restrict the ownership of firearms. Today, we're going to examine the issue from the standpoint of freedom, both historically and in the current world.
Our program today, as usual, will consist of our probe report on what's at issue, reactions from a group of average citizens somewhere in the country, and an in-depth analysis of the entire subject by our panel of experts. We'll begin our probe report, saving the Second Amendment, following this brief message.
This is one in a series of programs that takes a fresh look at critical issues affecting how you live and how you use your natural rights as an individual to make decisions about your life. At Issue is brought to you by the National Endowment for Liberty because we agree with Thomas Jefferson that government governs best that governs least. The National Endowment for Liberty is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational project. We do not accept state or federal funds. In fact, we don't count on any agency of government at any level to keep this program on the air. Instead, we count on the generous gifts of individuals, people just like you. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. If you missed any part of this message, keep your pencil and paper handy. This information will be repeated.
The first firearms didn't work very well. They were about as likely to kill the shooter as the target. But as they improved, they became a cornerstone of democracy. An ordinary peasant with a gun was more than the equal of a knight in armor. Never again would power belong exclusively to the aristocracy. The right to own a gun thus became a key element in the struggle for human rights. It was part of the British Bill of Rights in 1689 and was enshrined as the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1791. Today, the link between freedom and the right to bear arms remains. Tyrants still rule where the citizenry is disarmed. By way of contrast, consider Switzerland. Centuries of peace and freedom, and every man between 18 and 50 is a member of the Swiss militia and keeps his uniform, fully automatic rifle, and live ammunition in his home. For our founding fathers, an armed militia was a key reason for the guarantee of the right to bear arms. But today, most firearms are owned for other reasons, such as sporting, collecting, and personal safety.
And I truly believe that if it's known that more and more women own guns for self-defense, rape would decrease in the next 3 to 5 years. And I wrote Armed and Female for two reasons. The first was that I wanted people to know about that trend out there. And secondly, I wanted to talk directly to women and discuss the whole idea of self-protection and the fact that now most women are becoming independent and working out there. They at the same time need to defend themselves. And one of the best ways to defend oneself is by knowing how to shoot a gun.
I think that gun ownership is a fundamental right of every citizen. Now, I doubt whether I can make you believe that I'm an expert on psychology or law, but it doesn't take a PhD degree to understand that individuals have the rights to defend themselves. That's as basic as it gets. Someone tries to violate my rights, and I take any means necessary to stop them. Common sense, that's what you need to figure out this gun issue. I mean, who's going to obey the laws to ban guns? The people who don't obey the laws or the people who do obey the laws? Gun control groups should nickname themselves Save the Criminals. If someone tells me I have the right to stay warm in winter but can't own a furnace, obviously their mental thermostat is set on 0. And the right to protect myself doesn't mean a thing if I can't own a gun.
For gun collectors, ownership restrictions threaten both their investments and their sense of aesthetics.
There's no doubt about it that the collecting aspect certainly motivates a great deal of arms ownership. Actually, it has an appeal to people that is a mixture of that same ability to extend one's own physical force and strength together with the aesthetic aspect of the work of art, where you're able to understand the beauty of how a thing is shaped in connection with the purpose it's there for. You can see in firearms the appeals of beautiful racing cars or great motorcycles, or you can see in them the same appeal as you see in beautiful oil paintings. Almost every category of collectible objects have been tangible investments, really much more successful as investments than many securities. And in a world which may be in the future incapable of producing some of this beautiful stuff, possession of things like firearms and antique cars is something which is good as gold.
Sportsmen, too, have a direct interest in protecting the right to own firearms.
Hunting and fishing are my chosen sports, but they're also my livelihood as well.
The use of guns for sporting purposes, target shooting as well as hunting, is for millions of Americans a basic part of their inalienable right to the pursuit of happiness.
The right to be armed was one of those rights of Englishmen that the American colonists fought to protect. Englishmen for many centuries had a duty to be armed in order to help maintain order. There wasn't any professional police force in England until the 19th century. Therefore, the adult male citizens took turns standing the watch and were required, if they saw a crime taking place, to raise a hue and cry and set off in pursuit of the culprit and catch him if they could. They were also obliged to serve in a citizen militia or citizen army. While these duties were dangerous annoyances, they were regarded as far better than permitting the king to have professional soldiers keep order. It wasn't until the 17th century, however, with the trauma of civil war and then the efforts of Kings Charles II and James II to cut back on firearms and to disarm their opponents, that people began to see that it was necessary that this duty and obligation become a right. In 1689, therefore, when the English drew up their own Bill of Rights, the right for the subjects to have arms was included for the first time. At first, this was just seen as an individual right to defend yourself, but in the course of the 18th century, it was also seen to be a way that the people could vindicate their other liberties if these were ever threatened. And it was this dual tradition of an individual right and a way to protect other liberties that was passed on to the American colonists.
In the past several years, public concern about crime and safety has led some people to favor laws restricting or even banning gun ownership. And indeed, the criminal or negligent use of guns has resulted in many tragedies. In fact, other inanimate objects, such as automobiles, cause far more death and injury than do firearms. But surely it is use and not the ownership of the car or the gun that is the problem. Those who oppose gun control laws argue that gun crimes and accidents would be reduced by a combination of law enforcement, judicial toughness, and safety education. They also argue that an armed populace is a deterrent to both crime and tyranny, and that our great constitutional freedoms are too precious to begin chipping away at, regardless of where you start.
If we do not, under the existing phraseology of the Constitution, have a genuine right to own and carry firearms, then I say no other part of the Constitution is worth a damn either. It says what it says.
Remember when life was simpler and problems were solvable? When you could rely on good common sense and your own honesty and initiative to see you through? That was back before government regulation got so tangled up in our public and private lives, before paperwork and arbitrary rules took over and individual choice was locked out. The National Endowment for Liberty believes that most of our problems cannot be solved by government, that too much government is in itself a problem, not a solution. These programs are made possible as a public service by people who believe that moral and political rights go hand in hand with economic freedom. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058. Or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Liberty can set you free.
I mean, it's not the gun that kills people, it's the person that pulls the trigger. And like this gentleman said, crooks will always get a gun, just like drugs. They'll always get drugs. And it's only the innocent people that's going to get hurt by it.
Each week on At Issue, we show the probe report you've just seen to a group of citizens somewhere in the United States. What you're watching are the unrehearsed reactions of a group of people in Wichita, Kansas, to the probe report, Saving the Second Amendment.
If I've done wrong, if I was the one that shot somebody or done something, then take that dude away. But if I haven't done nothing, then leave mine alone. That's the way I feel.
What scares me about gun control is how far will they go once they start controlling guns. What's next? You know, and as they start to take away your freedom like that, and they start chipping at it, and you know, it's very dangerous.
They're already taking our freedoms away with guns, telling us what kind of guns we can own, what kind we can't.
I would be uncomfortable with registration because I would take Social Security as an example, our number. It was supposed to be for old age benefits, etc. Later on. You can't go to college without it. You can't go anywhere. Everything you do, it's tied into that Social Security number.
I mean, you know, China has effective gun control laws, and we saw that in Tiananmen Square this year, or in 1989. And I feel sorry for the Chinese people because they are literally under the gun, and it's not, and they have no options in those circumstances.
I don't think technology renders rights obsolete. I mean, freedom and certain liberties are either eternal or they're not, and I don't think it's something we can pick and choose and decide one day that a certain right is irrelevant or obsolete.
If you've committed a felony, you're not allowed to own a firearm or get a hunting license or any of that crap. I'll tell you what.
Legally you're not allowed. But
that's what I'm saying. If you think that's got them stopped, you're wrong.
I think that the people that are honest, the ones that are not going to cause the problems, are going to be the ones that, if it comes to losing your guns or registering them, are going to be the first ones down there to register. And the ones that are shady or they aren't going to want to get those guns down there.
I would throw this challenge out to the gun control advocates to honestly say that this Constitution needs to be changed and to work towards that, because they really don't. What they do is they say we're going to create a law that will have registration, or is going to have a waiting period, or we're going to restrict certain classes of firearms. They don't come up and say the Second Amendment is obsolete. They will not say the Constitution needs to be changed. They weasel around it. And that's why I think the gun control argument has been on a hysterical, irresponsible level.
Well, doesn't seem like people in Wichita want gun control, does it? Let's see if our panel of experts agree. Dr. Robert Cottrell is a professor at Boston College Law School and a specialist in constitutional law and legal history. Larry Pratt is the president of the Gun Owners of America. And our host and permanent panelist is the chairman of the National Endowment for Liberty, Ron Paul. Ron, what do you think is more important here, the practical considerations of crime and safety, or the theoretical principles and constitutional rights, that sort of thing?
Really, Mike, you can't separate the two. Every position that we hold, every aspect of what law expresses is really based on the theory behind it. So you can't separate the two. And we have to look at that. So we have to decide whether this is a good principle of freedom and is a legitimate principle of freedom. And then if it is, it has to be practical. So my argument would be is we have to decide whether it's a legitimate principle of freedom. Obviously, the Founding Fathers indicated that they thought it was, and therefore it should be the most practical. But I think that's our job, is to prove to the audience that it is not only good theory, but good theory always leads to practical conclusions. First, I'd like to start off by asking both the guests today something about the Second Amendment and how legitimate is this debate. The anti-gun people would like to say that really that was not what was intended. It was intended for the militia to have guns, not for individuals. Is there any legitimacy to this argument, or is this just a ploy on their part?
Well, I don't think it's so much a ploy. In the case of some people it is, but I think that one of the things is that we have to realize that by law, at the time of the framing of the Second Amendment, the militia consisted of virtually the entire free male population. The first Militia Act of 1792 put in the militia all men between the ages, all white men between the ages of 17 and 45. That was later amended in 1862, I believe, to include all men, black, white, and others. So that the militia has always been far broader than the organized militia, or what we might term the National Guard today. And so they meant the two rights, I think as Dr. Malcolm indicated, to really be interrelated, an individual right to bear arms, so that the state, that the defense of society would rest not on a professional army or professional police force, but on the citizenry as a whole. Essentially to prevent the state from having a monopoly of force.
That was the great concern that the Founding Fathers had. When you read through the debates and the arguments that were made for adopting the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment in particular, there was a lot of looking over the ocean at what had happened and what was happening in Europe. And people like Madison would say, well, the reason they have despotisms over there is that the governments do not trust their people with guns. So they were treating entire countries from those governments as if they were entire countries as slave populations. And the people here realized that slavery was going to come if they were not armed. If the government had a monopoly of force, there would be no way to stop raging bureaucracy from taking over the country.
So, by the way, if I might drop in, we all too often discuss this issue as if only the Second Amendment is involved. There's also a tremendous 14th Amendment question, which is the framers of the 14th Amendment very much wanted to make the states respect the Bill of Rights. And the 14th Amendment was framed after the Civil War by the 39th Congress, and one of the things that they were most alarmed about was that southern states were disarming the freedmen. There were black codes passed in 1865 and 66 specifying that blacks could not own arms unless they were in the army, whereas of course whites could. And if you look at the debates over the 39th Congress, this greatly upset the Congress because the one group of proven Unionists in the South were being disarmed, and were being disarmed because it would then be easier, in fact, to take away their rights. So this is not only a Second Amendment question, but indeed that principle of the individual's right to bear arms is reaffirmed if you look at the legislative history of the 14th Amendment.
I think it could be argued that it's a property rights argument too. It's a piece of property. We ought to have a right to own the property that we want. What about the recent trends? Do you think that this is just the movement against guns right now and the move for registration? Do you think this is just average, or is it different now than, say, 10 or 15 years ago? I remember, as long as I can remember, there's been an anti-gun movement. But are we more concerned about it today than we should be, or is this just sort of routine?
I think there's always been a tendency on the part of establishments, whoever the establishments are, to view guns as a problem for them, guns in the hands of the people. The New York Times used to be a conservative newspaper 100 years ago, and they were opposed to the right to keep and bear arms then. They're a liberal newspaper today, and they're still opposed to the right to keep and bear arms. The one thing that's constant, besides their opposition to guns in the hands of the people, is that they're in the establishment. And I think that's the the big problem that has not gone away. It's the same old problem of people who have power and increasingly may not consider themselves to have legitimacy, have only one way to maintain it, and that's through firearms.
Let me dissent from that to a certain extent. I think that we do have a real crime problem in this country. And I think we're really desperate to find ways to ameliorate that problem. And we strike out in different directions.
Bob,
yes.
let me ask you to hold that thought for just a moment. We're going to have to take a short break. We'll return to more views and comments on the subject at issue in just a moment. Thank you.
Throughout this series of programs, you will see ideas examined that affect every part of your life. We'll look at issues from a new angle, not from the left or the right, but from the perspective of individual liberty and responsibility. We believe our founding fathers were right. We are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these is the right to life, liberty, and property. We do not accept your money transferred through state or federal government agencies. Instead, this series is funded by direct voluntary gifts from individuals. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Call us right now, 1-800-333-3545, extension 909. For a transcript of this program, specify the subject and send $5 in a stamped self-addressed envelope to P.O. Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058. The National Endowment for Liberty, providing information on America's most precious resource, individual freedom.
Bob Cottrell, when we left, you seemed to be pointing us in the direction of the crime issue. Is that true?
Yes. I mean, I think that the movement, the gun control movement, is in part motivated by the crime issue. And, I mean, we face a desperate situation with respect to crime. Whole areas of our society are virtually unlivable because of crime, and people want to do something. And gun control seems to be an attractive measure. By the way, let me also say that I think that a distinction has to be made between gun control and gun prohibition. I would argue that we would have a very different debate on the gun control issue if, in fact, the courts had signaled that they were going to enforce the Second Amendment. Let's imagine the courts said you can go this far in terms of regulation and no further. That you might have a waiting period or licensing or what have you, but you couldn't ban firearms. Well, then we'd have a debate. Then it seems to me that the issue might very well move in the direction that we've moved with the First Amendment. Nobody really questions the ability of the government to have parade permits, to say that in a certain time, place, and manner, you have to march in a certain time, place, and manner, simply because we're not going to, for traffic control reasons and that sort of thing. And we don't question it, in part because we know the courts are going to enforce our basic right to peaceable assembly. Now, that doesn't mean I necessarily endorse registration or licensing or waiting periods, but we'd have a different debate over it. We'd talk about its efficacy and not about the slippery slope of whether this is a first step towards a ban.
Let me get back to that crime issue, because I think while the perception of crime is certainly a real one, what we have is an historical amnesia that has led us to forget one of the main reasons that we have a Second Amendment, which was to have an armed people so that people wouldn't be spectators in this great crime scene that's unfolding in front of us today. If people were armed, especially in those areas that are highly impacted with crime, if they were armed and they were organized and they were under the authority of the governing authorities, the police of the area, you would have much more likelihood of the people actually being able to effectively resist criminals who now can go in and exact revenge, kill informants who work with the police. I've been in foreign countries like Guatemala and the Philippines where until the people were armed and organized, there were insurgencies that were just sweeping over the country, and the people in the army were powerless to resist. Once the people were armed and able to resist that criminal element, the whole situation changed radically.
But Larry, we could still be armed. The liberal would argue if you still have the waiting period and the registration, we register our cars, we register everything else, so Why should you be worried about waiting periods and
there's
registration?
Quite an irony if we're going to be talking about registering our firearms, which actually can only work effectively if we have something, and when I've testified in Washington in the Capitol, this is what the senators are talking about. We can't really have registration effective unless we have a national identification card system. A national passport, internal passport, if you will. Well, that's the kind of thing that they're trying to get rid of in Eastern Europe right now. The people break into secret police headquarters to destroy those kinds of records, and we've got our politicians saying that that's the very kind of thing that we need. And one of the ladies on the panel out there in Wichita had referred to the same thing, how the Social Security number has gradually grown to a point where it almost is at that very place right now, being a national passport.
By the way, let me also dissent from one thing you said. I don't think it's necessarily liberals who are saying that. I mean, one of the things I think we've seen in the last year is we've seen conservative former Chief Justice Berger essentially say that he'd like to reduce.
Gentlemen, our time is getting pretty short.
The Second Amendment to virtual nullity, and we've seen liberal law professor Sanford Levinson in the Yale Law Journal say that we need to take a very serious look at the Second Amendment. So it's not
Bob,
a liberal conservative issue.
We need to wind this up. I'm going to ask each of you, if you will, to give us a final comment and give us some direction. Bob, what about you?
Well, my own view is that that we should look for congressional enforcement of the Second Amendment, and also I've advocated before and would advocate again that we should have a national waiting period of 7 days for firearms purchases, but we should also preempt more restrictive state and local legislation. No state or locality can ban a firearm or take more than 7 days to give it to the purchaser.
Larry Pratt?
Well, I would certainly disagree with any registration or restrictions or waiting periods like that. We don't make editorials wait 7 days before they're published. What we need is to have a better understanding of the importance and the value and the role of the Second Amendment in the contribution to liberty. It's not a sporting issue. Nobody ever debated whether or not we could shoot deer when they put the Second Amendment in the Constitution. It's there for our personal protection and to make sure government never becomes our master.
And Ron Paul, you get the last word.
Well, I think it is most important to see this issue as part of the overriding issue of individual liberty. If you understand liberty as that situation where nobody is permitted to aggress against another individual, we all of a sudden realize that we're allowed to own what we want and we're allowed to defend ourselves. And this is just one part of that. And if we honor and respect that, as the Founding Fathers did, if we obey the law, if we obey the Constitution, the people will be allowed to own guns. But in the broader aspect, they will understand that this is a freedom issue and a very important issue.
Well, that's where we'll have to leave it. I want to thank our panelists for being with us and you for watching. We'll be back next week with another vital topic at issue.
The National Endowment for Liberty would like to acknowledge the inspirational contribution of James M. Rodney and the sponsors of At Issue, whose generous support makes these programs possible.